Welcome back, my fellow peanuts, and welcome to anyone who is new to this podcast or to my channel. Now, this podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners, as there may be some graphic and violent content. Listener and viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to episode 25, guys. I think I'll be doing things just a little bit differently in this podcast. I was able to find out how the victims died in chronological order. So what we may focus a little bit more on this time, or at least on this podcast, is going to talk a little bit more about the victims rather than the serial killer so much. I will still talk about him, quite obviously, but I think the focus should maybe just shift a little bit in this circumstance, and let's talk about the victims. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do this with every podcast, but look, I'll attempt to focus a little bit more, and I have spoken about it on the podcast before, that I really do want to have a little bit more focus on the victims, because I do believe that we talk about a lot with what the serial killers did and all that kind of stuff, and their murders and their childhood and all those circumstances. And I think what gets lost in all of this is, at the end of the day, it's the victim's story that gets lost. And we need to remember that there were people that died in this circumstance. So I think it's really important for me to maybe just shift that focus just a little bit more. But anyway, guys, welcome to episode 25. Thank you to all of my new subscribers. I hope you've all had a fabulous couple of weeks. Since my last episode, I recently saw a new show on Netflix, and I'm so excited. It's about the Menendez brothers. I'm so excited. I'm definitely going to be watching that for sure. After watching it, guys, though, I may do a review, or I may do an episode on the Menendez brothers. I think it would be a good one. I may be a little bit more opinionated probably on the Menendez brothers, just maybe some of my own theories, and definitely what went down with that family specifically. Anyway, lost my trail of thought once again. Not hard to do. But anyway, back to today's episode. For anyone who is new to the podcast, I focus solely on serial killers in the USA. Specifically, I do a new state for every episode. Go back and watch those other episodes if you want. The map behind me, it depicts all the states we've covered off so far. There are 2 bonus episodes. One is on Martha Moxley and the other one is on Edmund Kemper. So go and enjoy them if you are new to the podcast. Now, our killer today, he killed across 2 states, specifically New York and New Jersey. But given that we've done New York recently, I picked New Jersey, guys. Our serial killer today is Richard Cottingham. He had 2 nicknames. He had the Torso Killer, and also known as the Times Square Killer. The reason he was killed, the Torso Killer, it's a little grotesque, guys. He would dismember his victims and quite often not leave their heads and their hands. He would very often leave only the torso behind. I did mention that he worked with Rodney Alcala, our last serial killer, on episode 24. So if you've already watched the last episode, you'd already know what I was going to be doing for today's episode, guys. So look, as I said, we're probably just going to focus a little bit more on the victims. So it'll be a little bit briefer than I normally am with what the bios and all those kind of stuff. So feel free to skip right ahead to the victims. The chapters will be there, so feel free, go ahead if you don't want to hear about our serial killer today. So Richard Cottingham, he was born on November 25th, 1946 in the Bronx, New York. He was the eldest of 4 children, and in 1948, the family would end up moving to New Jersey. Now, at some point in his early years, possibly preteen, I'm not quite sure. I couldn't quite gauge that out of some of the information. He began a real fascination with bondage and pornography, and he would attend middle school, St. Andrews. He had a little bit of trouble making friends, guys, but he did take an interest during that time in rehoming pigeons and just tinkering around the house with his mum and spending time with her. He would enter high school, I believe it was Passaic Valley High School in Hillsdale, I think it's called, and he became a little bit more accepted by his peers and a little bit more, had a little bit more friendships, but he was never really like a star. He always blended sort of into the background, but he would join cross country and the track team. definitely suited his personality, that wanting to be in solitude and just by himself with that long distance sort of running thoughts to himself. And I guess he could keep all of those bondage thoughts that he had to himself. And he would graduate in 1964. Now, after he graduates high school, he started working for the same company that his father was a vice president for. He would start out in the mailroom, and he eventually took some computer courses, and he worked his way up to a mainframe computer operator. From there, in about 1966, I think it was, he would go and work for the Blue Cross Shield. And as I mentioned before, that would be the time that he would meet, well, he wouldn't meet Richard Alcala, but they'd be like working in parallel. He worked for them right up until the point he was arrested in 1980. In May of 1970, he would get married. He and his wife would end up, I think it's 3 children that they would have together. And by the end of 1978, she had actually filed for divorce. She would file on the grounds of abandonment and mental cruelty. This would entail that he would refuse to have sexual relations with her after the birth of their 3rd child, and he would stay up all night. Quite early in the morning he'd get back, and he would leave her with insufficient money to even buy anything for the house, like food, all the essentials. But after his arrest in May 1980, she ended up withdrawing that divorce petition. She definitely did divorce him after he was convicted in 1981. So that's a really, really brief overview of like where we sort of are at. Now, just to give you a heads up, guys, there is some talk of that his father had some mental health issues. He was close with his mum. There's not a whole lot that I really was able to discover that niched towards that he was going to end up like a serial killer in the way he was. It's always really throws me off a little bit that people talk about signs and stuff like that, and I just don't know if serial killers do give out as many signs as we think that they do. Maybe it's hindsight's a wonderful thing, all of those components. So I don't really know if there was any underlying factors, but given that he was already sort of fascinated with that bondage and wanting to overpower women, I think there was already that in the ground in him of what he already fundamentally believed. So before it was discovered, though, that he was a serial killer, between October 1969 and March of 1974, he'd be arrested about 4 times, right? So 4 times. But these would include smaller sort of crimes like drink driving, some shoplifting. Now, there'd be 2 counts of robbery, sodomy, sexual abuse of a prostitute, and the unlawful imprisonment of a prostitute. Now, guys, that's a fine way to say you've kidnapped someone, right? So we're already sort of seeing that come out, that he was using sex workers. So we are going to be talking about sex workers. Not all of his victims were, but definitely we're going to see that target again on that sort of industry. He would end up paying a total of $100 in fines, which is actually equivalent to about $800 to $1,000 in today's currency. The 2 cases with the sex workers were dismissed as they ended up not showing up to court, which is nothing unusual and nothing we haven't heard before. Now, at the time that he was arrested for these crimes, the police were really unaware that they had a serial killer in their midst, and they certainly weren't aware that he committed any of these murders. Again, guys, it's a hindsight, it's a wonderful thing, right? Like, it's not like they looked at him when he was arrested and thought, oh, he's going around killing all these people. It's just not, it's just not feasible, guys. Now, I am going to talk about the victims in order of their death. These women were really, guys, they were forced to endure things that no one, not even your worst enemy, should have to be put through. They were really young and beautiful women who just didn't deserve anything like this. Not that anyone, God, that sounds so bad. No one deserves to go through what these women went through. So our victims begin in 1967. So this is 3 years after he's gotten married. He's only 21 when he begins his murder spree, we'll call it. But during his interviews and his confessions, I believe that he actually said he committed his first murder in his teenage years, but I'm unable to find proof of this specifically. So our first victim today, guys, is Mary Ann Della Sala. She was just 17 years old. She disappeared in January 1967. She'd just gotten off work from the ShopRite store. It's in New Jersey. She was not found for 3 months. And on April 20th, 1967, her remains would be found in a river near Hawthorne, New Jersey. She had been strangled, but there was no sign at this stage of sexual assault. Police quickly determined, though, that she'd been killed in a different location, and then she had been actually dumped in the water. Bit later on into the podcast, we're going to find out when he was convicted of all of these people, but I'm just going to be speaking about the victims specifically now. So we've got Nancy Bubby Vogel. She was 29 years old. She's a mother of 2. And in October 1967, she would leave her home. She was going out to play some bingo at the local church in Little Ferry. She changed her mind and she actually decided to go shopping at a mall. This is where she apparently ran into Richard. He would then kidnap her and he'd take her to a field where he would strangle her to death. He then left her in her car and she happened to be naked as well. They'd actually been acquaintances, so they knew of each other. And he was convicted of her murder in 2010, but he would confess to her murder. So we're sort of already seeing that pattern, guys, where the strangulation, so we've seen 2 women obviously die of strangulation. That's a really up close and personal way to kill someone. I'm not sure if anyone else has sort of watched documentaries on this or listened to any of the documentaries. It's a really personal way, and it's a lot of people say it takes a lot of strength. So our next victim is Diane Cusack. She's a mother and also a dance teacher. She was found deceased in the back seat of her Plymouth Valiant just outside Green Acres Mall, and this happened to be in New York. She had tape around her mouth and her neck. This is where we're going to see an escalation, guys. She'd been beaten, she'd been raped, and she had also been strangled. Now, she fought because there were defense wounds on her hands. Semen was found at the crime scene and DNA had been extracted. It would come back later in time to match Richard, and they believe he approached her at the mall, possibly as a mall security officer, and then he would kidnap her. He would be convicted of her murder in 2022, though. Now we've got Jackie Harp. She was only 13 years old when she would go missing from Midland Park in New Jersey in July 1968. She had actually been to band practice and she was performing as a flag twirler for the all-girl drum and bugle corps for the Midland School. When she failed to come home after practice, her parents would become extremely worried and they would notify the police pretty quickly of her disappearance. Unfortunately, the following morning, her body would be found. She'd been beaten, specifically in the face, and then she had been strangled with the leather strap of her flag sling. Whilst she was fully clothed, her clothes were described that they were in a bit of a disarray. So they believe that she had been sexually assaulted and it was a sexually motivated attack. Now, according to his confession of the murder of Jackie, he'd actually tried to convince her to get her into his car, and she had flat out refused. Brave girl. And look, stranger danger, right? He stopped the car in front of her and caught up to her despite her attempting to run away from him, and he would then drag her into the bushes and he would actually kill her there and then. Now, at this stage, guys, we're not seeing him decapitating and dismembering our victims. So it is later that we are going to see that the escalations. So these, just so everybody is aware. Now, we've got Irene Blaze. She's only 18 years old when she's been reported missing in April 1969. But just after a day of searching for her, she was found in about 4 feet of water in the Saddle River. She'd been strangled with either a cable or some wire, or possibly even the necklace that she'd been wearing at the time. He would confess to her murder in 2014, but during this confession, he would actually say that he had seen her out shopping when he would approach her and he'd invite her out for a drink. Now, somehow he had convinced her to go along with him for this drink, and they would take a bus to another place, and they would spend some time together. It was then he offered to take her back to the bus station, and that was when he would murder her. So I'm not sure if you've seen the pictures of in the background of Richard. He is a very sort of normal looking person. You really wouldn't think two ways about it. He just looks to me like a dad. He doesn't look like anything sort of startling or something to be afraid of, right? So it's just, I see where it's going. Then we've got Denise Falaska. She's 15 years old when she would leave her house in New Jersey in July 1969. This was around 8 o'clock at night. She was headed out to meet some friends like we all did at that age, and she wouldn't return home at her curfew time of 11 p.m. Now, there would be witnesses that would actually place her along Old Hook Road going towards Westwood. That was about approximately 9 o'clock. The following day, her body would be found in New Jersey. In 2014, Richard would also confess to her murder. He said that she'd been walking down the road in Emerson when he spotted her and offered her a ride. It was shortly after that he killed her. I'm just going to take a drink, guys. I'm so sorry. We do have quite a few victims today, so this may take a little bit more time. We've got Lorraine McGraw. She was found in March 1970 by a group of hikers just in New York. It would be in the woods of Tweed Boulevard. I'm not sure where that is, but she was found naked with marks around her neck. It was indicative that she had been strangled. She'd been dead for nearly 48 hours when her body had been discovered. She was only 26 years old at the time. She lived in Long Island. She'd been missing since February, so she'd been missing about a week, and she'd been reported to have a long list of criminal offences, and they'd been specific to drugs and sex work. She was known to have worked at many different clubs and bars and what we would consider adult establishments. This is probably, unfortunately, where Richard would actually find her. It was in August of 2022 that her murder would actually be resolved because he would confess to that as well. So we've got Mary Beth Heinous next. She's disappeared in May 1972 at the young age of 21 years old. She'd actually been diagnosed with epilepsy and was known to have grand mal seizures. She was not found until 5 days after she had actually disappeared, and when her body was discovered, it would be near a creek at the Rockville Centre in New York. It was noted at the time, though, that there were cuts on her neck and her face due to her being strangled. So at the time of her disappearance, she'd been getting on a bus to go to a dance. In December of 2022, Richard would confess to her murder, and he would state that he had actually thrown her body off the Rock Centre's Boulevard Bridge. We're seeing that he's got a real hate for women at this stage, and just a real lack of empathy, and he's just treating them like garbage. Like the way he is just discarding them. It's just, we're seeing a real pattern here. Now we've got Laverne Moy. She was a 23-year-old mother of two from St. Albans in Queens. Her body was discovered at the Rockville Centre Creek in July 1972. She had also been strangled. He would admit to her murder again in December 2022. During this time, he would admit dumping her off the same bridge that he had actually dumped Mary Hines. Now we've got Sheila Heineman. She's 33 years old. She's from New York, and in July 1973, she would be found beaten and stabbed to death in her home by her husband when he had returned home from visiting a department store. She was actually found in the bathroom. Now, there was no evidence of a struggle in any other rooms of the house, and none of the neighbours had actually heard or seen anything odd in the area around the time of the murder. It's also been noted that she hadn't been sexually assaulted. He would confess to her murder in December 2022. This one I'm a little bit skeptical on, guys. There's just the stabbing, the victimology, it's just a little bit different, and also the manner of death. Now, I don't completely know, but it's just, this one for me, it feels like maybe he was looking for some attention, but I'm not sure again. But I do like that the family have gotten some type of closure for this one. Now we've got Maria Henrietta Rosada Neves. She's 18 years old. She's a Puerto Rican national, and she had been found strangled to death as well in December 1973 in New York. She was found near a weeded area close to the bathhouse, to the East Bathhouse bus stop. That's near Jones's Beach. Now, when she was discovered by one of the park employees, she'd been wrapped in a grey blanket and covered in plastic bags. This is another one that he confessed to in December 2022. Now, the fact that she'd been wrapped in a grey blanket and covered in plastic bags, I don't know whether that was to hide her or was that possibly something else. So they're just a little bit of a gut feel, not sure. Maybe there was some remorse there. Now we've got Lorraine Kelly and Mary Ann Pryor. They're 16 and 17 years old when they left New Bergen, New Jersey in August 1974. They're going on a shopping trip at the Garden State Plaza. They had originally been with Lorraine's boyfriend, and then he would leave them at the bus stop in New Jersey. So the girls had actually intended to hitchhike from the bus stop to the to the mall. They had not been seen alive from this point onwards. 5 days later, the girls had been actually found dumped in a wooded area in Montvale, New Jersey. Now, both the girls were found bound together at their wrists, ankles, and they'd been naked, lying down, facing each other. Now, when they're found, the girls had been deceased for somewhere between 36 and 40 hours. Both of them had been beaten, raped, and appeared to also have been strangled. They would even have cigarette burns on their bodies. He was convicted of their murders. So Richard's convicted of those murders in April of 2021. It was during these court proceedings, right, that he confessed to kidnapping the girls. He then tied them up and raped them at a motel before he would end up drowning them in a bathtub. The escalation is just, it's just really apparent to me. And then we've got Marianne Marzi Carr. She was a 26-year-old X-ray technician who would go missing in December 1977. She'd go missing from the Ledgewood Terrace apartments. Now, she was last seen talking to a man in the apartment parking lot. So they would describe this man, as someone, he's a white guy. He's 30, around in his early 30s, and he's got brown hair. It should be noted, though, around this time that Richard and his wife had actually lived in those apartment blocks. So I'm presuming that he was the man that she was talking to. He then said during his confession that he kidnapped her from the parking lot and took her to a Quality Inn in Hasbrook Heights in New Jersey. Now, once he was inside this room, and the reason I think he's taking them now to motel rooms is because he can have some privacy and he can do some really, really fucked up shit. He would torture her with beatings, bites, slashings with a knife. He would then rape her. And during this whole entire time, he would choke her and restrain her at the same time. So once, unfortunately, she had died, he would dump her in the parking lot of that Quality Inn. He had left the item that he had used to strangle her around her neck. And when her body is found the next day, she's still in her nurse's uniform. Her left leg was visible through a slash on her pants. She even had a clump of her own hair on her right leg. Her shoes were missing from the crime scene. She's got numerous amounts of bite marks and cuts, all along with what looks like to police as handcuff marks to around her wrists and also around her ankles. There was also residue from tape which he'd placed on her mouth. He would be convicted of her murder in October 1982. We are going to get to that, but keys to her apartment building were actually found in his home after his arrest. So that's how they were able to correlate that he had murdered her. Our next victim thankfully survived. However, her brutal assault is absolutely disgusting. Karen Schilt was 22 years old and pregnant when she met him at a bar in Manhattan where she would work as a waitress. So this is in March 1978. He introduced himself as someone named Joseph Schaefer. So after a while, Karen would leave the tavern where she worked and she would head home. Though it's not a really long distance back to her apartment, he would actually offer to pick her and drop her off. But during this ride, she actually began to feel really sick in her stomach. He had given her some pills and to help her with this, and she would take them. Now, shortly after she's taken these pills, though, she's completely knocked out. So by the time she would wake up, she'd been admitted into a hospital. A patrolman by the name of Raymond Arga of the Little Ferry Police Department had found her motionless near the Ledgewood Terrace apartments. He would immediately pick her up and drive her to the hospital. She's a pregnant woman and this is what you do to her. You're just an absolutely appalling and vile human being. He would rape Karen when he was done and he left. He would leave her on the side of the road, near a sewer, I believe it was, with her breasts and other parts of her, just in general exposed. So that's what that policeman was exposed to. It was just absolutely disgusting. Now we've got another assault. This time this was Susan Geiger. She's a 19-year-old sex worker who Richard called himself Jim at the time, had approached in October 1978. She explained that she was actually quite busy for the rest of the evening and would end up giving him her details. The next evening, though, he called her and made plans to meet with her at about midnight. He picked her up in his Thunderbird, and then they would go to a tavern on First Avenue. Now, while on the way there, he piles her with drugs mixed with drinks. She would initially describe him as what she thought was friendly. She would end up waking up in room 28 of an airport hotel in New Jersey, and she is covered in head to toe of her own blood. She'd been tortured with just injuries to her breasts, her face, her private parts. It's just appalling. He had beaten her several times during this, and it was with a garden hose. He'd ripped her earrings from her ears. It's just when she's taken to the hospital, obviously, but once he looked inside that hotel room, once the police looked inside that hotel room, they would have several pieces of evidence and they take it to the labs for testing. They were able to uncover that there was some seminal fluid left behind, and this happened to be a type O blood. This level and escalation of what he's doing is just insane, guys. Like, he's now using drugs to help facilitate him to be able to do more to his victims. Our next victim, unfortunately, is not a survivor. It's Dide Godzari, Godazi, I think it is. And there would be an unknown woman as well that would be found in December 1979. They would be found at a travel lodge motor inn. So around 9 a.m., a staff member at the hotel would call 911 for a possible fire once they'd noticed a significant amount of smoke coming from one of the rooms, 417 in particular. The room had been rented to a Carl Wilson, and he had a do not disturb hanging on the door. Once the firefighters enter the room, they discover two female bodies lying on the beds. The women had been tortured and sexually assaulted, apparently for days leading up to their deaths. Both women at this stage had been decapitated and had their hands removed. So the man responsible for this had burned their bodies to cover up his crimes, I imagine. Their missing body parts have never been found. It would be pretty soon after the discovery that they would discover that it was Didi Godzari. And she happened to be a 22-year-old Kuwaiti immigrant. And the other victim, unfortunately, has not yet been identified, and she's been referred to as the Manhattan Jane Doe since the discovery of the victims. Now, Richard is eventually convicted of their murders in July 1984. But we're going to come back to that. Our next victim would be Valerie Ann Street. She is 19 years old. She's a sex worker, and she was found at the Hasbrook Heights Quality Inn, where Marianne Carr was actually found. Now, when Valerie checked into the motel with him, she had used an alias herself. So she called herself Shelley Dudley. After Richard had murdered Valerie, he stuffed her underneath the bed in room 132, and housekeeping would eventually find her body, and they had found that she had been tortured and suffocated. She had been handcuffed. She's got ligature marks all around her neck. They realized that she'd also been gagged with tape. She was another victim who happened to be found with similar bite marks all over her body. There was just multiple scarring to her private parts and her breasts. He would end up being convicted of Valerie's murder in June 1981. Our next victim is actually a surviving victim, and we've got Pamela Weisenfeld. She would be found beaten in a parking lot in New Jersey in May 1980, and she had met Richard, and soon after she'd met him, he had drugged her as well, and he had beaten her. There were multiple injuries again to her body, and when the police arrived at the scene, they would take her straight away to hospital for treatment. Now we've got, unfortunately, a non-survivor. So we've got another victim. We've got Jean Reiner. She's 25 years old when she was found in May 1980. Her body would be discovered at the Sebel Hotel in New York City, and her killer had actually cut her throat and removed both of her breasts, and he would leave them on the headboard of the bed. He would then set the body on fire in an attempt to destroy that evidence. He would eventually be convicted of her murder in July 1984. Now, you can sort of see that escalation where he's now mutilating the bodies, and this is sort of what happens a lot of the time in these circumstances, that we just see that over time, the murders get more and more vile and more violent. It's just all these things accumulate, and it's almost like all this anger just gets worse and worse and worse every year. Now, it would be his assault on Leslie that would lead to his eventual arrest and eventually his downfall. So there's an assault on a Leslie Ann Odell. She's an 18-year-old sex worker that he picked up in May 1980. So after hours of being tortured by Richard, she would scream out for help, and officers would find her in room 117 of the Quality Inn in the Hasbrook Heights. He was really quickly apprehended as he tried to flee down the corridor of this particular hotel room. At the time of his arrest, though, he was living in New Jersey with his wife and his children, and he would be spending his days working in Manhattan as a computer operator. So he's got a real double life at this stage. He's just absolutely next level with his life. He was charged with 9 crimes when he was arrested. The indictment listed charges as kidnapping, attempted murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and aggravated sexual assault while armed. There would be a rape charge and a sodomy charge. So it was pretty vile, and an additional charge to oral sex. There would be a possession of a weapon, which happened to be a switchblade, and a possession of controlled substances. So barbiturates and also diazepam. So after his arrest, police would find a room he kept locked in the basement of his actual home. Now, in this room, and in particular, the trunk of his car or boot of his car, they would actually find items that belonged to several of the victims that we've been talking about. There were definitely indications that he was living a double life. He even had his own apartment in New York City that he would tell his wife that he needed for when he worked late nights in Manhattan. I suspect he used that to engage in all sorts of acts, and what he couldn't do when he wasn't killing, he was probably using sex workers and torturing them there, and they probably didn't come forward, I'll be honest. Apparently, while he was at home with his wife, he would spend excessive amounts of time in the basement. They would find in this basement, they'd find trophies from his victims. There was several graphic bondage pornography works. There would be handcuffs, and there would even be what they would call slave collars. Further investigations would definitely connect him to more crimes, and his fingerprint would be quickly found on Valerie Street's crime scene. When the police would search his home, they found mountains of evidence that would link him to other murders, such as Marianne Carr's apartment key, a toy koala, and a pair of earrings that belonged to Valerie Street, jewelry belonging to Dita and Jean Reiner. His handwriting would also link him to motel rooms that he had rented and committed killings inside. So he would be convicted of only 5 murders in the early 1980s, but 2 separate trials would be held, one in New Jersey and one trial in New York. So at this stage, when he's first caught, they can only link him at this stage to 5 murders. But over the course of the New Jersey trials in 1981 and 1982, he's convicted of 3 non-fatal assaults. So this is Karen Schultz, Susan Gaga, and Leslie Odell, and the murders of 2 women, which would be Marianne Carr and Valerie Street. But in the New York trial, he would be convicted of 3 deaths specifically, which had occurred between 1979 and 1980. So these specific ones relate to the Manhattan Jane Doe, Dida Gazzari, and also Jean Reiner. So even though he wants to talk, he doesn't talk for quite some time, guys, because it's not until 2009 that he finally admits to more than 5 murders. Another trial comes up in 2010, which he would actually plead guilty to the murder of Nancy Vogel. Now, after that trial, he would actually make a deal to confess to the murders of 3 more New Jersey schoolgirls, but he would demand immunity from those murders. But then he goes on trial in 2021 and he pleads guilty to the kidnapping and the rape and drowning of Lorraine Kelly, Marianne Pryor in 1974. In 2022, he makes another deal to avoid prosecution, and he confesses to more murders. This startles me that the prosecution were willing to not convict him. And I think the reason behind that is fundamentally he's already serving life sentences. So I get the reason behind it, but I feel like there should be some convictions for this. There's a whole entire awesome TV show on Netflix, and I think it's called Crime Scene: The Times Square Killer, and it goes into all sorts of depth of the murders and what happened and how we got all these convictions. In 2023, he would be convicted of the murder of Marianne Della Sala. That's the very first victim we referred to. I have absolutely no doubt there's more victims that'll be revealed over the coming of years, either identified through DNA or more confessions from Richard, because I do think he genuinely enjoys the spotlight. I do think it's really difficult to get these killers to not enjoy the spotlight. They're just so adamant what they enjoy. So it's just, I don't know. For me, it's just not great. But we have come to an end of the podcast today. So thank you all so much for watching episode 25. I really appreciate all you guys. Do me a favor and hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, go and watch more episodes. I've got a TikTok, I've got an Instagram. So if you ever just want to have a look at some sneak peeks, I'm thinking of putting up like 10 sneak peeks of each of my episodes, just in case people haven't watched them. So please feel free, guys. I hope you all have a fabulous weekend, my fellow peanuts. Have a great one. Bye, guys.